Thanks so much. It's great to be here with everyone today. As Jim mentioned, I wear a couple of different hats, and one of those hats is going to change next week. But prior to all that, I also was a software developer and worked in cybersecurity for around a decade before coming back to the academic world. So with all of those hats on, as you can imagine, I'm a huge nerd. But I think about the world in a couple of different ways. Some ways like you, like algorithms. Other ways like economists, thinking about equations and variables and all those fun types of things as well. And so today, I'm going to get started by just showing you a very simple economic equation that we often use to think about how some good or service creates value for the economy, right? So we think about a very simple way of thinking about this, and the value created by something is the price times the quantity. And so about a decade ago, we started looking into open source software, and we said, oh, we have this great equation from economics. We can apply this to open source to understand what the value of open source is. But I think you can probably guess where I'm going. Price equals 0 for open source, or at least most of the time. So that's not going to be helpful. And then quantity equals who knows, because you can copy it and share it and give it to your friends and modify it and all the fun things that we love about open source. Turns out it makes it hard to measure it from the economic standpoint. And so we thought about this for a while, and we have, over the last decade, have come up with a number of different ways to really think about what is the value of open source. And in particular, we relied upon some of our business friends. If we can't solve this with economics, maybe we can solve it by thinking about it in more of a business perspective. So those of you may have heard of this quote from Warren Buffett before. He talks about how price is just what you pay, but value is what you actually get. And so in our context, that's why we're talking about the value of open source. We want to understand what it contributes to society, what it contributes to companies, and how we can measure that in ways that allow us to actually better understand and get some sense of size of this economy, right? So Jim already sort of teased the headline of this, and I saw a few hands go up that have seen this report. But where we're headed is that we end up finding out that the value of open source is almost $9 trillion. And actually, I'll talk a little bit about this, and this is actually, we know it's an underestimate. We know it's actually more than this, right? So today, I'll give you a little bit of background on some of the research that myself and my team have done over the past few years, thinking about how do we measure something where the price is 0 and the quantity is, we have no idea. And at the end of the day, my goal is to give all of you ammunition to go back and argue with my students, my MBA students, who may be in your organizations, trying to convince you that contributing to open source in particular is not worthwhile and not good for the company. Now you can tell them that this guy that you saw on stage said, actually it is, and he's a professor at a business school, so you have to believe us, right? So that's my goal for today. Excellent. So, I mentioned I wear a couple of nerdy hats. I think in an alternate life, I actually would have been the nerdiest of the nerds, which is an astrophysicist, at least in my opinion. And so when we started thinking about this, we were trying to think about what are some other things that are out there that we know exist but are very hard to measure. And so we settled on dark matter as a corollary. For those of you not familiar with dark matter, I hear some laughing, okay, good. So dark matter is this thing we know exists in the universe, but it's very hard to measure because we can't see it directly, we can't observe it directly. And so the way that the physicists have measured it is by looking at kind of what happens around it, right? And so we can measure this kind of secondary effect, and then we can actually use that to think about what dark matter is. So we decided to do the same thing with open source in an old paper we called Digital Dark Matter, to apply some tools to be able to measure what is the impact of this, even if we can't measure it directly. And so we decided to start narrow. This was 10 or 12 years ago. We didn't have all the great data tools that we have today. And so we started with one project. We started with the Apache HTTP server. Why did we start with this? Well, it was a pretty popular project. It still is. But more importantly, the whole point of a web server is to connect to the internet and to be public. And so we were able to use, I mentioned my cybersecurity background, some old hacker tools. Maybe you've heard of Nmap. We use this to scan the US internet IP space to just just knock on the doors and say who's running Apache and who's running other things. Now, again, in this context, we know it's an underestimate. People are using Apache behind their firewalls in many ways, but at least this gave us some measure of Q for one particular project in the US. Now the question became, how do we think about P and the price of open source? So here we decided not to reinvent the wheel, but instead relied upon somebody who later goes on to win the Nobel Prize, but Bill Nordhaus, who talks about replacement costs, right? So he's trying to measure things like the value of clean air or the value of domestic labor in the house. And when we think about, in our context, what we looked at was something that was fairly similar, not exactly the same, but Microsoft's IIS, right? And this is, again, back a decade ago. So some of the, there were some differences, but we tried to pair up the versions of Apache with the versions of IIS and get some measure of what the cost of implementing an IIS server would have been, and then backdoor that into what the value of Apache was. So we multiply those two together, and we end up with about $12 billion, right? And this is, again, a decade ago. And so the question then, of course, becomes, to me, $1 billion is a lot, but to the US economy, is that a lot? So we found some other numbers and looked at what companies in the US spend on private software, on prepackaged software. And it turns out that this $12 billion represents about 9% of what companies spent on prepackaged software in 2013. So pretty substantial, right? And again, this is only one open source package, and this is only thinking about the US. We also wanted to try to understand the cost side of this and what went into creating Apache. Some of you that know your open source history may know that the Apache HTTPD came out of the government investments in the supercomputing centers in the US. So there's, I think it's 12 or 14 supercomputing centers around the US, all government funded, and out of that came many things, many great things, but one of them was the Apache web server. And so what we did, when we thought about the investments that went into creating the supercomputer centers, and if Apache was the only thing that came out of it, it still would have been an almost 20% return on investment for the amount that the US invested in. For those of you, in business school, we teach that, if you get a 5% rate of return, that's pretty good. 10% is excellent. 20% is fantastic. So again, if Apache was the only thing that came out of these government investments in the national supercomputing centers, this would have been an incredible win. Now, this may be targeted more at a different audience, those who think that investing in R&D is not a worthwhile thing to do today. This is, hopefully this helps us prove them wrong. All right. So we can measure this one project in one country, but how about the rest of the world and the rest of the open source projects? We knew we were going to need to partner here, and so a few years later, we partnered with the Linux Foundation to release what ended up being called the Census 2 report. The Census 1 was an older report that was just focused on the kernel. But we partnered with a handful of software composition analysis companies to try and measure and understand the open source being used at thousands of companies across the world. We end up seeing about 600,000 data points of open source usage. This is pretty good, but then last year we update this and work with a few more partners, and they've gotten bigger, and we end up with getting information on tens of thousands of companies and the open source that they use, and over 12 million observations of individual open source usage in production. So important to note that these are open source packages being baked into software that these companies are then going on to sell, right? So again, think about what we're using this for our Q, for measuring quantity. This is definitely an underestimate because we're not accounting for things like the Linux kernel, because that's not necessarily being baked into packages, or browsers, or more open source types of package or full applications. And so we'll talk in a minute when we're thinking about going with this in the future, but now know that this is definitely an underestimate. So now we have our Q. Now we have to think about P. We can't do that same kind of replacement cost analysis because here we have thousands of open source packages, and so we can't find a good replacement cost for all of them. So what we end up doing is something that I had done in a previous study looking at a regulation in France that encouraged companies companies to contribute to open source, and able to show that that led to about $20 million of value created out of France. But the way that we did that was we used this model called Kokomo 2. This is an old model from the Department of Defense in the US that they use to try and estimate the costs for any given software project. It's based on the lines of code. You turn that into person hours, and then you multiply that by the kind of average salary of a developer, and you get some sort of price for based on the lines of code. I know lines of code is not perfect. There's messy lines, there's good lines, there's more efficient lines, but it gives us something, right? So it gives us something that we can say, roughly speaking, the cost to replace this piece of open source software would be whatever, would be X, right? And a few of our friends in the EU and also from NSF in the US use these same types of models to think about the value being created coming out of the EU. For the first one, they estimated about €1 billion in terms of replacement value for the open source coming out of Europe. The US estimates about 38 billion. And so we can use these types of methods to, again, get some measure of what's the replacement cost for a broader set of open source packages. Now, the problem with both of these studies is that Q equals 1, right? So they're just measuring what would happen if all of the open source repositories were deleted, but the idea of open source still existed, and we just needed to pay people to rewrite all this code one time so that everybody can use it again, right? And that, when we think about that, that's important, but we wanted to think about more broadly, what if open source as a concept didn't exist, and all the companies that are using open source had to rewrite this software from scratch themselves. And so we end up having our Q from the census, so we can think about the broad use of open source within companies. We have P from this Kokomo model, and so we start by thinking about if we had to do this once, what would it be? We end up with about $4 billion. Again, this is less than some of those other estimates because we were focused on only the most widely used open source packages as opposed to kind of the long tail that is there and is important, but isn't necessarily creating tons of economic value. And then we multiply by our Q, and this is where we get our almost $9 trillion. So we think about the open source that's being used by companies and baked into the software that they're developing, and we back out the price by using the Kokomo model, and here's where we land with that. And so when we think about this, a couple of things came to light. Jim already kind of teased that if we looked at the global investment in software in a given year, and if open source didn't exist at all, then companies would spend about 3.5 times more on software than they currently do. And another thing that we noticed that was particularly interesting was that about 5% of the contributors to all these most widely used projects were creating about 96% of this value. So some of you 5% maybe in this room, thank you for your services. We greatly appreciate it. Tell your boss that you need a raise. Yeah, there we go. All right, applause line, yeah, that's a good one. And then again, this is definitely an underestimate, and I'll talk more about where we're going in the future, but we're going to try and expand this to get closer to some of those other pieces of the open source ecosystem that we weren't able to measure. All right, so that's kind of how we think about this in the economic terms. Now let's put our MBA hats on and think about how do we think about this from an individual business. So it turns out businesses care about costs, right? So we want to think about what is the value that we're capturing. We talk about this a whole lot in the MBA classroom. The value that our company is capturing, we have to factor in costs to this. And guess what? All of you are those costs, because if you're contributing to open source, then you're not doing other things for the company at that time, right? And so when we think about this type of equation, we were able to actually show and do some research to show how companies can capture value from open source, not only by using it, which I think we've all sort of, most companies gotten to the point where we recognize that it's valuable to use it, but also from contributing to it. And so just a few quick statistics, 15 years ago, only 40% of companies said that they even used open source. I did some earlier research that shows that open source usage increases your corporate productivity, and then by today, we have about 97% of companies using open source. So I blame myself for that increase in open source usage. There may be some other factors at play as well, but we can think about, companies have figured that out, right? Now, where they haven't figured it out is on the contributing side, and I think this is the particularly even harder to show. How do we think about the value of giving back and paying my developers to write code that the world can use? And so again, we did some other studies and ended up showing that at least for a subset of companies, those that that contribute end up getting 2 times more productive value back from using open source than their free-riding peers who use it but don't contribute. And then we also, in that French study, were able to show at kind of a country level that, when France kind of nudged their companies to start contributing to open source more, we end up with a large increase in the IT employment sector, which is generally thought of as a good jobs and good sector to increase. And we also see a large increase in the percentage of startups in the IT space that are coming out of France compared to other EU countries. So most of this stuff is all good. We can see that most of this data is based on big companies. And so we also wanted to dig deeper into startups and think about what's happening in that land. And here we've done a few very recent studies thinking about the value of open source to startups, which we have to measure in a little bit different way. But we're able to show that when startups increase the amount that they're contributing to open source, they get larger venture capital investments, they end up with higher valuations for themselves, and they're more likely to have a successful exit, so IPO or acquisition or things like that, which we would generally consider good for those companies. And then when we think about this again at the country level, countries that sort of induce and encourage their startups to contribute more to open source leads to more tech startups, higher quality tech startups, and more global-oriented startups that are going to go on to be larger and bigger and take over the world potentially, right? And so again, when we, a lot of the things I do are looking some things at company level and some things at country level, but in the startup ecosystem, we see this big boost for contributing to open source across the board. All right, so we should always contribute to open source, right? No. So that's not, I think that's one thing we would love to be able to say is everyone should always contribute to open source. But it turns out that there's actually a variety of reasons or times when it makes more or less sense to contribute to open source. And so we have a brief article on this thinking about, what are the conditions when it makes more or less sense for a company to actively contribute back to open source. So we break this down into 5 different aspects. When we think about the technology that you're creating, if you're very early or very late in the tech life cycle, then it's a good idea to be more engaged and more collaborative with your peers. If it's lower in the tech stack, so further away from user land, we often see this is I think this is something probably this audience is pretty familiar with, but this is another place where we see less differentiation for these companies happening, and so it's better for us to share the costs and collaborate rather than kind of do everything in a box by ourselves. And then we also want to think about whether or not the market that we're competing in for whatever technology it is that we're building, is it likely to become a winner-take-all market so that there's going to be one company that dominates that market for whatever reason? If the answer is no, then it's more likely we're going to contribute. Or if the answer is yes, but we can possibly control the standard, we already heard some things about standards today, then it's more beneficial for us to be contributing as well. And then the last 2 are thinking about, again, the level of competition that we face in the industry. If it's very high or very low, we want to see more active collaboration, and that's generally going to be a good thing for the business. And then finally, when we think about sort of the societal opinions about our technology, is there a good social acceptance of our technology? So just as an example, there's lots of people that don't really love AI yet in the user land, and so we're not quite there yet. And so that's, in my opinion, why we're seeing more collaboration and more open source happening in AI right now. And on the flip side, not the individuals, but on the government side, we're also seeing a lack of regulatory clarity for AI in general. And so we're going to see more collaboration in open source activities as well. And so, this all sums up to this phrase that I've heard others use in the industry, but we try to have it here as well. But think about collaborating on the core of whatever it is in your industry, but then competing on the edges, right? And so your MBA colleagues will love this idea of, okay, we're going to be competing on some things, but collaborating on others, as long as we're not like open sourcing everything, right? So again, my goal to give you ammunition to talk to your MBA colleagues and convince them that you should be contributing to open source. So a few things on the horizon. Of course, AI and ML, we've done some studies looking at how that impacts open source contributors. We looked at GitHub Copilot, and they rolled out free access to some maintainers. And we found a whole bunch of interesting effects. In particular, people increased the amount of time that they spent coding and decreased the amount of time they spent on project management, which is actually quite nice because a few years before, we had done a survey of open source maintainers and found that many of them them said that this balance was very out of whack, that they spent way more time on project management and way less time on coding than they wanted to, and it seems like AI is going to allow us to kind of readjust that balance. And then Jim also mentioned earlier the kind of thinking about open source AI. We're doing some work trying to estimate the value of open source AI, and we'll be doing, and the Linux Foundation research project that Jim mentioned is just the start of that. We're going to be trying to gather more and more data to be able to build on that and really understand in those same ways we valued open source, how do we think about valuing open source AI. We're going to expand on the census. So the next version of the census, we're going to try and expand into operating systems, applications, the cloud, to get a more complete picture of open source software. We're going to think about open source hardware as well. To me, an often under thought about aspect of open source that's driving a whole lot of value in our world. And then lastly, we're trying to build some data sets with the LFX team doing LFX Insights and thinking about different data sources that we can use to better understand and better equip all of you for those conversations with, with your management, right? And thinking about how do we convince them that contributing is actually better. So keep an eye out on this. We're ramping those up as we speak. And then lastly, thank you, Gen AI, for the picture of person drinking a glass of data. But when we think about the data, all that data that we've used for all these studies, it came from lots of you, right? Came from companies. So if you have data that you think is interesting related to any of these topics, please feel free to reach out. And if you remember only a few things from this presentation, remember that open source is worth $9 trillion. Companies who contribute get way more out of using it than those that don't. And we don't always want to contribute. We want to collaborate on the core and compete on the edges. And you can help us help you convince your bosses to let you contribute to open source more. So that's it. Thanks so much, and look forward to talking to everybody later. Thank you.
Hold on one second. So I love talking to Frank all the time, and I'm excited about the value of AI, open source AI, because your inputs just got much broader in terms of the ability to measure that.
Yeah, that's right. And I think especially, in all the stuff we've done before, we've measured the value of the code itself, but obviously in AI, we also need to think about the data, the weights, the inference that happens later, and so it's a more complicated, but potentially much more impactful ecosystem as well.
So when do you think that's going to be published?
Right after I get off the stage. Soon. Keep an eye out.
All right. Thanks, Frank.
Thanks, Jim.
All right.